This is TLV1.
Hi, this is Gilad.
And Dahlia.
We have a special request to you, our loyal listeners. We deeply appreciate your interest, and now we're asking for your support.
In an atmosphere of fleeting headlines, fact skepticism, and a perceived cheapening of the public discourse, we firmly believe in the audience's appreciation of deeper learning and deeper understanding. We know you do too. At the Tel Aviv Review, we love to bring guests who represent a variety of perspectives on the serious work being done in and about our region. But we aren't exclusively restricted to Israel and Palestine and the Middle East. Rather, we cast our net wide for cutting-edge research and literature on global issues to put our own into perspective.
The Tel Aviv Review is the only Israeli podcast that offers in-depth insight into ideas and culture with a broad political range and no limitation on a variety of topics. We like everything, but we need your help. We don't want to limit access to our show and, more importantly, we'd like the show to survive. Your contribution will make all the difference. Believe us, we're not in it for the money. Our shoestring budget covers just production and professional costs. That's why we're launching this appeal and asking you, yes, you, to sign up to donate very modest sums of money. So modest, you'll be embarrassed if you don't.
Trust us on that. It's really easy. Just go to our website, www.telavivreview.org. That's one word, telavivreview.org, and you'll see a donate button. Thank you so much. We look forward to providing you with many more exciting interviews in the future. The Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you very much for coming tonight. I'd like to welcome you all to City University for this special recording of the Tel Aviv Review podcast. For me, it's personally a particularly emotional moment. I am a graduate of the journalism BA program here at City, and it is really heartening to be back here at the strikingly renovated Tate building after more than a decade. And thank you very much. It's really nice to see you, so many familiar faces and familiar ears. So thank you very much for coming. And this is a live recording of the Tel Aviv Review podcast, which is an Israeli English language program dedicated to books and ideas. It's broadcast on TLV1 Radio, which is an online radio based in Tel Aviv. And our program is sponsored by the Van Neer Jerusalem Institute.
I'm Dahlia Shenlin. Thank you for coming, everybody. Tonight's event is extremely special because we have the opportunity to speak with our author live. And we'd like to thank the City University of London, as well as Dr. James Rogers of the Journalism Department, who's co-hosting the event with us. And, of course, our distinguished guests. Ian Black is a very, very veteran journalist. He hardly needs an explanation, but let's do it anyway. He was The Guardian's Middle East editor, European editor, diplomatic editor, and foreign leader writer for 36 years on the paper. He's now visiting senior fellow at the Middle East Center at the London School of Economics.
Tonight we'll be talking about his brand new book. It's entitled Enemies and Neighbors, Arabs and Jews in Palestine and Israel 1917 to 2017. It is published by Alan Lane, an imprint of Penguin Books. It's an extraordinarily comprehensive overview of 100 years of conflict in our little corner of the world. Ian, welcome and thank you very much for coming tonight.
Thank you. Very nice to be here.
Let me start by asking you this. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is arguably the most commented upon issue in the world. When you set out to write this book, what dark corners in the historiography of the conflict did you wish to shed light on?
Well, I don't think it was so much about dark corners. There are dark corners, but when you're looking at a story as long and as complicated as this, I think the fundamental thing is to try to tell the whole story in a coherent and interesting, hopefully an accessible way, to give it a sense of, if you like, of the elements of continuity, of the relationship between different periods, language, of references, of terminology, and how what we call history actually unfolds. So there are no stunning revelations in it. There's no shock horror moments or smoking guns or anything like that. The sheer scale of it just didn't allow for that. I haven't done, I should say what I haven't done as well as what I have done. I haven't, uncovered any previously unknown documents or come up with any amazing revelations. Because given the scale of the story, it's about a century, but it's actually about more than a century. It's a century because of the obvious neatness and the ease of taking 2017 and going back to 1917 because of the momentous Balfour Declaration, whose centenary we've just marked. So it was about covering a century and more, going back to, starting in 1917, but going back a little further to the 1880s when Zionist settlement began in Ottoman Palestine. So it's about covering a century and more. It's about, and this is perhaps was my most important ambition, it's of and from both sides of the story. That was my hope. Now, people will have to judge whether I've achieved that. But to try to tell this ever contentious, controversial, toxic, divisive story, I mean, Donald Trump is opening a new chapter right now, even as we speak, to try to do that, but give the perspective of both parties to this conflict.
I want to spend a bit more time on the starting point, as you said, 1917, even though you go back in the book to the origins of the Zionist settlement of Palestine in the 1880s. And of course, Zionism did not start in 1917, or the conflict didn't start in 1917. Why did you choose 1917 as your starting point? I mean, at least in the title, I mean, covering 100 years of conflict.
You know, 1917 matters because it's the centenary of the Balfour Declaration, and we can talk about its significance. But it is amazing, and many of you will know this. I imagine you're interested in this subject, otherwise you wouldn't be here. So it is extraordinary how in the seventh year of every decade for the last 120 years, something significant has happened in this story. I could whiz through them. You've got 1897, the first Zionist Congress. Okay, 1907 was the aftermath of the Young Turk Revolution. Leave that to one side. 1917 is the Balfour Declaration. 1927, there was a very bad earthquake in Palestine. It was unusual. It was a natural disaster rather than a man-made one. 1937 was the report of the British Peel Commission, which of course famously recommended that Palestine be partitioned into separate Jewish and Arab states. 1947, we've just had the 70th anniversary of the UN's partition decision. And so it goes on. 1967 needs no introduction. 1977 saw the rise of the Likud to power in Israel, Anwar Sadat visiting Jerusalem. 1987 was the first Palestinian Intifada, and it goes on and on. 2007 saw the Hamas Islamist movement take over Gaza. I have said before that I think the thing people will remember about 27 is actually Donald Trump and whatever effect he turns out to have on the story.
And what's happening right now. I want to go into the introduction. You have, in addition to all of this fascinating archival work and a lot of detail, you have insights that sort of appear throughout the book. And right in the introduction, you write that one of the fundamental differences in this conflict is that Jews focus on their intentions in the early stages of Zionism and Palestinians focus on the results. I thought that was an important insight. I want to know why you said that, and primarily I want to know, is there any way of each side seeing the other perspective? In other words, is there any possibility for the Jews to try to understand what have been the results for Palestinians, or for Palestinians to say, well, we can understand the intentions, even as we criticize the results, or is that totally unrealistic?
You know, people have tried to do this. There have been valiant efforts over the years to try to bring together you can call them conflicting narratives. I think the narratives are irreconcilable, not just conflicting. The different ways that Palestinians and Jews or Zionists or Israelis, whatever you want to call them, see this conflict. Well, and now what is a narrative? A narrative is how people see their own history, how they tell their own story. It's very, very hard to combine them. On the occasions it's been tried, they end up having to be printed on parallel pages because they just don't fit together. Nevertheless, I think it is possible for each side to certainly to look at the other, reject it as propaganda, as lies, as self-serving nonsense, as they invariably do or often do, but nevertheless to accept that that is how the other protagonist sees things and to try to deal with that. I mean, I think that a difficult situation, to put it mildly, can only be improved by greater mutual understanding. Whether it is, a central theme of the book is inevitably is the Palestinian Nakba, the catastrophe, as they call it, of 1948. I think that Israelis could understand more about the impact of that. I think Palestinians, I'm not trying to draw precise parallels, but I think Palestinians could be more attuned perhaps to the unique tragedy of Jewish history, the relationship between the Holocaust and Zionism and so on and so forth. It can't do any harm, it can only help.
It seems like the whole narrative, the whole story is really a series of crises and debacles. I'd like to ask you whether, while writing it as such, you felt that there were some exit points along the way, that things like momentous turning points, that things could have turned differently.
There's a whole school of sort of historiography of people who look at this conflict. As we've said, it's been studied very, very intensely over many years. It's the subject, I think it's more PhDs are written, certainly in Britain, on this subject than on any other Middle Eastern subject. I mean, thousands of books appear every year in English, in Arabic and Hebrew. And there's a strong theme that recurs, which is about missed opportunities, moments in the history of the conflict when things could have been different. Well, of course, we don't actually know because that's counterfactual. We know what did happen. We try to explain why it happened. We don't know what would have happened if those decisions or moves hadn't been taken. So, for example, one of the most important of those is, of course, November 1947, when the UN in the early days of the Cold War, voted to partition Palestine into separate states. People will be familiar with it's a very dramatic story. People on the Jewish side, clustered around radios to hear the vote being broadcast live. The Palestinians less aware of it and very negative about it. And the decision that really was, more than the Balfour Declaration, the moment that certainly created the State of Israel, did the Palestinians make a terrible error? Well, you can argue that they made a terrible error, but I think that if you look at the story and you follow it really quite closely, you understand, nevertheless, why they made that decision. So a mistake, but in my view, and actually my view of this has changed slightly in the course of writing the book, an understandable mistake, given that they were being asked to agree to part of what they saw as their country being handed over to another people who they saw as foreign intruders. Pragmatically, bad decision. Politically, arguably an understandable one.
In addition to all this thinking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict per se, you also have a lot of insight into the development internally of each society. And I'm struck by another overall theme, which is how many things do not seem to have changed or have very, very old roots that we see coming back. On Israeli society in particular, you quote a very interesting passage from 1918. I want to quote it for a minute. You quote Lawrence Oliphant describing early European Jews in the following way. Fresh from the ghetto of some Romanian town, unaccustomed to any other description of exercise than that of their wits, but already quite convinced that they knew more about agriculture than the people of the country, full of suspicion of all advice. With these Romanian Jews was the Arab Jew, who acted as interpreter in Oriental garb, as unlike his European co-religionists as the Fedahim themselves. Now, I found this a fascinating passage because we have something of the Israeli personality going way back to the beginning of the century, and already some of the cleavages in Israeli society. So I'm curious, do you think that these divides, this cleavage within Israeli society can ever be reconciled between the European and the Middle Eastern? And that leads me to a bigger question, which is, to what extent could things have been different, apropos the previous question, if the Europeans had made more of an effort to integrate into European culture? Into Middle Eastern culture.
I mean, actually, it's a great passage. It's from Lawrence Oliphant. Lawrence Oliphant was a famous English, he was a sort of Philo-Semite. He was a Zionist, an early Zionist, but the passage is from earlier. It's from the 1880s. And why does that matter? It matters because the date does matter, because it really is one of the very, very earliest description I've ever read of an encounter like that, of these very early Jewish settlers. I think it's from 1881 or 1882. It describes a meeting which was held in a place called Zamarin, which became Zichron Yaakov, which is now a substantial town in Israel, but it was one of the very first of the colonies, settlements, whatever you want to call them, founded by the Chovevei Zion, the lovers of Zion. And what's interesting about the passage, I think, is indeed, I mean, there are a couple of elements, aren't there? There's these newly arrived Romanian Jews who have never seen, a plough or an ox or, let alone, toiled on a stony hillside, but they think they know what they're doing. And the man who really matters is the native, Arabic-speaking, Sephardi Jew, who, of course, was a middleman between them and the people they bought the land from. So it's an early, if you like, it's a kind of capturing an image, isn't it, of some of the core elements of the conflict. I think early on, I have to say, the emphasis on the sort of European, or the European identity of the early settlers. There are interesting movements in the early days of people who are native-born Sephardi Jews born in Palestine, who are far more aware, naturally, of the environment, and they speak Arabic quite often, and how to deal with the natives. The newcomers don't, they're baffled by it, they're puzzled by it, and that, I think, is the really interesting question, the one where there is continuity to this day of how the early Zionist settlers perceived, dealt with what from very early on they called the Arab question or the Arab problem. It's often described in Israeli history or Zionist historiography as the unseen question. That's a famous article that was written by Yitzhak Epstein. But it wasn't an unseen question. It was a very visible question. What matters is how they dealt with it. And one of the things I've been struck by in looking at this subject and revisiting what for me was quite a familiar subject was how very early on, from the very beginning, before the First World War, before the Balfour Declaration, this understanding was that there was a real problem with Arab opposition to what the Zionist movement wanted to do.
So do you think that in a way it was a self-fulfilling prophecy on both sides? They knew that they were heading for conflict and, the rest is history?
I do. I think that is absolutely the case, that from very early on, and I don't want to bore you with too much detail, I also want you to read the book, of course, but I mean, if you find extraordinary examples of this early awareness, and I'll give you two short examples. In 1910, there was an Arab journalist, a Palestinian journalist from Haifa, whose name was Abdullah Mukhlis. He was a kind of hack of those days, but he wrote in significant newspapers, published in Damascus, and in 1910 he wrote an article in an Arabic paper talking about how the Jews of Haifa were setting up a new soap factory, Atid, the future soap factory. And it was worrying because they were starting to only employ their own people and only to interact with members of their own community. And that wasn't the way that Ottoman society actually worked. And he really expressed fears for the future if this trend continued. That's in 1910. In the summer of 1917, a few months before the Balfour Declaration, a colleague of Chaim Weizmann, who needs no introduction as the leader of the Zionist movement, the man who received the Balfour Declaration, this man was called Harry Sacker. He was quite well known, a British Zionist. He actually worked for the Guardian, the Manchester Guardian, in those days. He wrote to a colleague, June or July 1917, about how, I paraphrase, but it was something like, however well we do with what we're trying to achieve, there will remain this problem of the Arabs. They're not going to take this lying down. We can't behave towards the Arabs like the Poles behaved to the Jews in Poland, and we won't have the excuse even of being in the majority. 1917. So yes, that's one of my emphases, if you like, in looking at the early history.
No, I mean, it seems interesting. It's interesting to me that at that time there was this acknowledgement that this is how people of a land react when their land is colonized. And that's how we see people reacting, certainly when there's an empire breaking down. I mean, some of us lived through this with the breakdown of the Soviet Union, the rise of nationalism, the rise of responsive nationalism leading to ethnic conflict. Why is this so hard for Israelis to understand that the Palestinians react like that now, if they understood it so long ago?
Well, I mean, we're talking about different periods and understanding changes. I mean, I think in the early period, people are operating with the assumptions of colonialist thinking, which doesn't pay much attention to what the natives want. I mean, after all, one of the complaints, if you look back again, discussed much recently about the Balfour Declaration, was that the British government promised what it promised about a Jewish national home and so on, and it added the qualification that nothing must be done to prejudice the rights of the civil and political rights of the existing non-Jewish community. They were 90% of the population at the time. Nobody consulted them. So that was part of the colonial mindset that was the zeitgeist that was then current. If you're asking about what happens later on, it's of course a different matter, because colonialism goes out of fashion, does it not?
Well, it's interesting that even at the very earliest stages after the Balfour Declaration, there were Palestinian or Arab-Palestinian demands for it to be annulled. And that has continued, well, not exactly in an unbroken streak, but certainly the Palestinian Authority has taken this up over the last, year or so. What does this represent? Do you think that demand to somehow, and cancel the Balfour Declaration has changed in nature? Was it originally a denial of the right to Jews to have a homeland in the region, and maybe now it's a protest against the imbalance? Or do you think that there is still a rejection on the Palestinian part of the right of Jews to have a homeland in the region, which is certainly one of the themes you hear in Israel, right?
Well, I think if you're talking about, current demands, I think the demands about the Balfour Declaration are an expression of frustration. Nothing much could be done to undo the long-term impact of that. The Balfour Declaration, of course, was supplanted by what the United Nations decided in 1947, arguably far more important. Arguably, that wouldn't have happened without the Balfour Declaration. But the UN vote, 1947, gave the State of Israel a legitimacy which, initially rejected by all Arabs, has now come to be accepted by the majority of Arabs. I think the thing that matters for purposes of this kind of conversation is to remind ourselves that the Palestine Liberation Organization, which was founded in 1964 with the view of eradicating the illegal, racist, colonialist, Zionist entity, in 1993 recognized the State of Israel. That remains to this day. That's something that is forgotten, but it shouldn't be forgotten because it does represent a historic shift and an adjustment on the side of the Palestinians. Reluctant, pragmatic, not joyous, but nevertheless to the existence of the State of Israel. And that lies at the core of everything that we're discussing today, and we'll discuss even more when we've seen what Trump says in his speech. But that hasn't been revoked. Not everybody is bound by that. Hamas doesn't accept that. It's an issue, but the PLO recognized the State of Israel, and it continues to do so.
I want to go now to the act of actually writing the book, researching for it. As we said, the sequel is being written as we speak. The book is meticulously researched, even dense, I would say, has really oozing facts. It holds more than 500 pages because it's a long and eventful conflict that it covers. I want to ask you, how long was the first draft, and what did you have to leave out?
Well, of course, all I have before me now is the finished product. It's hard to recapture the agonies that I went through. I think that the thing I found difficult was to retell a familiar story, but in a slightly different way. I think that was what I really found challenging. There are so many books on this. You say my book is long. There are books that cover the same subject that are twice as long. Mine weighs in at a modest something like 600 pages. So it wasn't a question so much of drafts and tearing things up and starting again. It was a question of telling a familiar story with the familiar landmarks, the wars, the diplomatic initiatives, the uprisings, the peace process or whatever, but not to focus solely on those, to give some sense of ordinary people on both sides, their lives, the way their lives were affected by it, not just every few years when there was a huge crisis, but more conventionally, more routinely as they interacted or didn't interact and ignored each other. So that, I think, was what I found challenging, was to enliven it and to enrich this familiar story, to give it maybe a bit more depth than is conventionally done.
Speaking about things coming alive, so much of this conflict, you witnessed yourself, you covered it yourself, and you lived through a lot of these things. Did you have any sort of disparity of making the history come alive because you had to research it and you didn't see it yourself versus the parts that you must have experienced so strongly in your own mind?
Yeah, I'd like to add to that and quote you from the book saying, quote, "Arguably, I learned as much reporting from the streets of Nablus and Gaza during the First Intifada as from poring over declassified files or old newspapers in archives in Jerusalem and London." I think it adds to Dalia's question about creating this balance between your work as a historian and your work as a journalist.
And just to say, that's not a hidden criticism. I think that it's very smooth, but I'm curious about your experience.
I can do criticisms too, open or concealed, don't worry. But I think what I would say is this. I lived through parts of the story. Not the whole 130 years. It's true, despite my great age. I did live through some fascinating times, and I have some very vivid memories. But I deliberately didn't try to write a first-person account. I slightly disapprove of that. I don't want to be censorious. First-person journalism has its limits as far as my experience shows. The fact that I watched in horror as something happened is not terribly relevant when thousands of other people watched in horror and did that far more often than I, the journalist watching, did. And of course, there was also a practical problem because although I could describe what happened when, the excitement when Sadat landed at Ben Gurion Airport in 1977, thrilling, unbelievable moment, or I could describe some of my experiences particularly during the first Palestinian Intifada, which was very, very memorable and exciting time. I couldn't do that. I wasn't in a similar position in 1937 or in 1917 or whatever. So I had to deal with that. And the way I dealt with it was, to some extent, was to remove myself. But hopefully my own experience and my knowledge, but my personal experience did enrich what I was able to write. Again, those two examples are good ones. The first Palestinian Intifada was an extraordinary time. It was very, very vivid. It was you had a feeling of, that the sort of the wings of history were flapping around your ears, which is a rare thing to feel. Maybe we feel it now in this country with Brexit. But some of the experiences you have, and to be a journalist is a great privilege. You get to see things. You have a responsibility. But so that informed the way I wrote the book. People, friends, acquaintances, contacts on both sides with whom I, as a journalist, interacted, endlessly.
I want to go back to another one, the theme that I raised before about how much of this seems to be repeated or long-term processes and themes that appear cyclical. I have a few examples. It might take a little while to read them. But you wrote, for example, of the Bus 300 affair, where there was a bus hijacking. Palestinians hijacked a bus. 2 of them were later captured alive, filmed, and then killed. It was a cover-up. And then we just had the Azaria affair, where an Israeli soldier executed a Palestinian who was already incapacitated. That's one example. You write of the simmering rage of Palestinians against PLO elites in the late 90s and 2000s and the corruption and the $2 million villa of Abu Mazen. You say 56% at that point said the PA was corrupt. Nowadays, Palestinians are angry at the PA for being corrupt, and 2/3 want Abu Mazen to resign. Another parallel. And then, just as I was reading the part about Ariel Sharon taking his famous walk on the Temple Mount in 2000, which sparked the Second Intifada, here we are getting headlines rolling in about Trump making a little bit of drama about recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital. And to quote you, quoting Dennis Ross said, "I can think of a lot of bad ideas, but I can't think of a worse one." These things seem so cyclical. There are parallels for every consequential thing that happened. We have 3 Gaza wars, 2 Lebanon wars. Are we up to more than 2 Lebanon? No, 2 Lebanon wars.
And counting.
What breaks the cycle? Do you see moments or processes that can break these cycles?
Well, there hasn't been one yet. I think, all the things you've mentioned, there are indeed elements of continuity, and they're all still going on, as you say. I mean, you take the example of the Bus 300, that's about Israel's security. Okay, people hijacking a bus, obviously. You can't let people hijack a bus wherever you are. But, of course, in Israel, the people who hijack buses are Palestinians, and the people who fight them are Israelis. And then in that particular case, it's the role of, in that case, the Shin Bet, the Israeli domestic secret service, and there's a cover-up, and that has a corrosive effect on Israeli democracy. But, on the other hand, that story, it's a familiar story, perhaps to many people, that there are brave people who have values and they worry about democracy and truth, and there are whistleblowers, one of whom I know quite well, actually, and they make sure that the story comes out. So the people who unlawfully kill the hijackers are brought to justice in some way. Continuity, the soldier Azaria who killed the wounded Palestinian in Hebron, the same issues are in play. The difference, of course, it's not just continuity, it's worse, is it not? I mean, you know better than me, I think, what the figures are in terms of Israeli Jewish support for clemency for the soldier who did that.
Very high.
So 1984, I think the bus hijacking this was last year. It's worse. The burden on Israeli society of the maintenance of occupation. The corruption of the PLO, same difference. A liberation movement becomes something different, a quasi-government, though not quite a government and not in control of its own territory. Somebody, Ahmed Khalidi, put it very well. It was a liberation movement that after Oslo wasn't doing much in the way of liberating. It wasn't accountable. People feathered their own nests, and the same issues hold true today. There's no political horizon for people to look forward to. So the flaws and the defects of that governing system are painfully apparent.
As our time is running up, and before I hand over to James, just like to ask you this question. You, also as a journalist for The Guardian, of course a high-profile and very respected newspaper in the West, in Britain, you wrote this book for a Western audience, predominantly, I assume. What do you think, based on your experience in writing this book, that the West misunderstands most about the conflict. It is a central player in the conflict. What does it misunderstand?
I'm not sure that it misunderstands it. I think there is wide understanding today, certainly wider than ever before, that the only way to resolve this conflict with its long history and complex roots and asymmetry between the two sides is, what Lord Peel in his wisdom came up with all those years ago in 1937, that you have in this one small country with all its resonances and appeal to so many different people and conflict, that you have irreconcilable national aspirations. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And I think the only way to deal with them is in that conventional, prescription for giving them each their state. There is, of course, this huge imbalance between the sides. And there's been a failure of the international community, which, again, we're seeing another dramatic manifestation of that as we speak, to deal with it as required for reasons that, we're all quite aware of. But I think the fundamental truth is understood. I think that the problem now is that, I won't be the first person to say this, nor the last, that the prospects of that happening appear to be receding. And that is a tragedy for both peoples, more so for the Palestinians, because they're suffering a lot more as the result of an absence of that solution, but for Israel as well, as you know only too well.
All right, on this optimistic note, I should say, let's hand over to Dr. James Rogers of the journalism department here at City. Let's swap seats for the...
It's like the good cop, bad cop interrogation, it feels like.
Thanks very much, Gilad, Dalia.
Now you're in trouble.
Ian, it's become regrettably fashionable in the era of fake news to criticise journalism. I mean, that's obviously nothing new criticism for anyone who's covered the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I mean, what was your experience of that when you were a correspondent, and how do you deal with it?
Well, it's a really interesting question, in a way, because it highlights how much things have changed. I was the Guardian's correspondent in Jerusalem starting from 1984. It seems like ancient history. And it's ancient history, certainly in the sense that it predates, of course, all the things that we now completely take for granted. Mobile phones, email, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, God help us. There was none of that at all. So, of course, as ever, there were people who didn't like, or sometimes who did like, but mostly the ones you heard from were those who didn't like, the way that the story was reported. But in those days, in the 1980s, there would occasionally be, a letter that would be sent, by snail mail to the editor in London, and if it was serious enough, it would be passed on by snail mail again to the Guardian's office in Jerusalem. But then, it might then be a couple of weeks since the letter had been written, so whatever, white-hot fury it had been written in had sort of dissipated by then, and there was time to give a reasoned response. It was just... the issues were the same, but there was nothing like the level, not the speed, the toxicity, the volume that anybody who... you don't have to be a journalist to be aware of it. Anybody who uses social media is aware of it. Look at Twitter, look at Facebook today on subjects that you know about and care about. So it was a lot easier. The issues were the same. It wasn't as harsh as it has subsequently become. I would say that there are a couple of landmark moments. One was, I was involved in, but before I was the correspondent, the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982 was a significant moment. It was a significant moment in Israel because it was a war of choice. It wasn't necessary. It was launched for overtly political reasons by, devious politicians, Ariel Sharon, Begin, and so on. But the international impact, the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, the siege of Beirut, Arafat cowering in his bunker like Hitler, as Begin famously said, that was an important moment in the ongoing story of the transformation of Israel's international image. You can't pinpoint it. These are processes that go on over a long period. So 82 was significant, but the Palestinian Intifada that erupted in December 1987 really was the beginning. What built on, everything builds on the changes that had taken place before. And the Palestinian Intifada really did do, why do we use cliches? We use cliches because they tell a story in a shorthand and convenient way. It really was the reversal of the old, David and Goliath. Suddenly, the Palestinians, with their slingshots and stones, were literally the Davids confronting the Israeli Goliath. And it was an extraordinarily dramatic and empowering period that put the Palestinians back onto centre stage, if you like. So those were two of the moments. And of course, you can go on and on and on, but there are always events that sharpen, clarify, whatever, not only in the media, more important for ordinary people. The media is the messenger, the interpreter.
Key moments in the competing narratives, if you notice. I mean, you say very early on, you set out your story and you say, these master narratives are not so much competing as diametrically opposed and utterly irreconcilable. Now, that dilemma obviously comes up a lot in day-to-day reporting, but how does the challenge alter when you have 500 or you suggested 600 pages? Can you do those master narratives more justice with that sort of space to play with?
Well, I like to think so. That indeed was one of my motives, that, everybody who's worked as a journalist knows the limitations and the frustrations of telling a complex story in what is always a limited space. Even in the age of the internet, you can't write endlessly. Things have to be manageable, accessible, and so on. So to be able to revisit these issues, but to have more space, the ability to explore things a bit more is, of course, great. You have to, nevertheless, still, you can't write endlessly. You have to tell a story as well as interpret it. It's quite a complex process. There are facts, and then there are interpretations of facts, and so on and so forth. But I think certainly the space and the platform gives you a greater ability to zoom out and to give a sense of that big picture in which you locate the crucial detail. Trump and Jerusalem. Everybody here will have read over the last 24, 48 hours, efforts to explain this very complicated story. Actually, why can't Jerusalem be Israel's capital? It is a complicated story. It's hard to reduce to, 400 or 500 words. When you have the leisure, the space to do it, and to tell the story, I remember the book that you wrote, very interesting book about reporting on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which I remember writing about in The Guardian. The immediate context of that was trouble on the Temple Mount at the beginning of what some people described, if you recall, as the Third Intifada. It wasn't really a Third Intifada, but it looked as though it might be. And it was vital then, I remember you writing and me responding to that you really needed to know what had happened to Jerusalem back in 1929 to get a sense of why this was such a hypersensitive issue now as then.
Yeah, I think history is absolutely key to understanding it for a foreign correspondent. A very difficult thing sometimes to bring into day-to-day news coverage. I was very interested and very struck, Ian, by what you wrote about the situation after 1948 when the city was completely divided and there was only that one crossing point, the Mandelbaum Gate. And you say, foreign diplomats, clergymen and pilgrims were able to cross, but ordinary Arabs and Israelis could not. So, there were similar times, and perhaps even now we're moving towards a similar time when one thinks of the way that the Palestinian territories are not accessible to many Israelis and vice versa. But how important a factor in your perspective was the fact that you, as a foreign passport holder, could go to places that many Palestinians and Israelis couldn't?
It was absolutely crucial. I could live in West Jerusalem, where I did, and I could get in my car and I could drive. This is before the... even during the Intifada, but certainly before the first Intifada, I'm sure many of you will know, many of you will have been there. It's a very small place. You can get up in the morning, have breakfast in West Jerusalem, and you could be having coffee in Ramallah half an hour later, and an hour later you can be, eating wonderful knafe or hummus in Nablus. You could do that.
If you've got a foreign passport.
Yeah, it's true. It always helped to have a foreign passport or a foreign ID or whatever. And of course, things have changed on that front too. Hasn't remained the same. There used to be Israelis roaming all over the West Bank far more easily than there are today. Today, if you go into the areas of the West Bank that are deemed to be under the control, I use the word carefully, of the Palestinian Authority, there are big signs for Israelis in Hebrew and English and Arabic saying, you may not enter this, your life is at risk. You're not allowed to do it. That wasn't always the case. That was only after the Second Intifada, I think. Palestinians moved far more frequently and never easily, but more easily inside Israel than they did again after the Second Intifada. One of the tragedies, I think, of recent years is that even under the conditions of military occupation, Palestinian economic dependence on Israel, and Israeli dependence on Palestinian labor, for that matter, there was a degree of human interaction that was drastically reduced after the Second Intifada in 2000, after Sharon's visit to the Temple Mount and the ill-judged Palestinian decision to have an armed uprising against the Israelis. The human consequences of that, never mind the people who lost their lives in horrific acts of violence, but the human consequences of it, but there was very little interaction. Young Palestinians and Israelis today very rarely see each other. Palestinians meet Israeli soldiers, settlers sometimes, secret policemen, and that's about it.
I remember being in Gaza during the Second Intifada when I was based there. I was then in my mid-30s, and most Gazans of my age had had casual jobs in Israel. Some, of course, had been in prison, but they had had some kind of interaction with Israelis, which was almost entirely absent amongst the younger generation, people under 30. Building on that subject, Ian, you write about the politics of language, who learns what, who speaks whose languages. Now, you speak Hebrew and Arabic, and most Western correspondents don't. How important do you think was that to your insights?
Well, yeah, language matters, wherever you are. I mean, language enables you to better understand the people you're talking to and the society you're covering, and it gives you insights. I mean, it does, technical things like you can read what it says, that slogan on the wall, or you can hear the order saying, disperse or we will open fire. It's obviously quite useful to be able to have that ability. I mean, I'm struck actually by talking about journalism, how today younger people in a vastly more competitive world are actually much better at studying foreign languages. I think an older generation, my generation, people a bit older than me, were rather, not great. I mean, there were always individuals, there were stunning, brilliant linguists, and there still are, but there were never many of them. I think younger people have a far greater understanding, certainly those who aspire to be journalists, of the need to master the language and the culture and the things that go with it.
Now, you made the transition from correspondent to historian in publishing this book, but a lot of the issues which you raise here are relevant to day-to-day news reporting. They're also frequent subjects of the criticism of day-to-day news reporting. But what sort of place can history have in day-to-day news reporting, and how do you get it into those 500 or 600 words?
I think the answer is with difficulty, but you do need to try and do it. I mean, again, how can we understand the row that is unfolding now without some sense of the past? And even quite a lot of detail about it. It's perfectly possible to do, but you have to make the effort, and you have to... I think people know. They think, why is this a problem? Why is there so much controversy about this? And you need to think about how to explain it and to contextualize it, not just to report the slogans that people inevitably come up with, but to give some depth, if you like, and the necessary context to explain why these things are happening. I mean, it's difficult, but it can be done. You don't have to write 190,000 words to tell the story.
Now, we're recording here in front of an audience, so I'm sure we'd like to bring some of their questions in soon. But I just want to conclude by asking you one more question. We read a lot today, especially when talking about what attracts audiences on social media, about emotion. Obviously, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict provokes a huge amount of emotion, but there's only place for that emotion in the reporting of it.
Yes, I think there has to be. How can you, we're all human beings, we all have emotions. How can you convey what people are experiencing without giving some sense of how they feel? I think that, again, in the age of social media, we're all intensely aware of the power of images. I mean, there have always been images, of course. They weren't invented yesterday, but the proliferation and the accessibility of images. I mean, Israel-Palestine, I'm not sure that I can think of anything memorably vivid, but if you look elsewhere in recent years across the wasteland of the Middle East, think of the pictures of children in Yemen, people suffering in Syria. But of course, emotions also have to be contextualized too.
And for the reporter, though, should correspondents show emotion? Because obviously it does. They are human beings, as you say. Is there a place for emotion in the reporting?
My answer to that question is linked to what I said earlier about the kind of first-person journalism. There was a famous row, wasn't there, at the BBC with Barbara Plett-Usher, as I recall, who was the BBC correspondent in Jerusalem or Ramallah or whatever. Yeah. And when Yasser Arafat died in 2004, she was overcome by emotion and wept. I'm not sure that was a great idea, to be honest. But, she's a human being, but perhaps as a journalist you need to put your humanity at least, to one side or in abeyance or save it for drinks at the bar afterwards. I don't know. I think that your role is to describe what other people are experiencing and not to thrust yourself to be at the centre of the story.
Thank you so much for these interviews and these conversations. What we're going to do now is open it up to the audience because we want to give everybody a chance to ask your questions. And we have about maybe 25 minutes for moderated questions. We'll take maybe 3 at once.
Okay. So my question, I apologise in advance if it's a bit simple, but I was just wondering whether there are any parallels worth talking about between the Balfour Declaration and what we expect Donald Trump to say today in terms of historical significance and controversy. I know you said not to waffle, but I was struck, I've been thinking about this a lot today, but I was struck by what you said that about feedback you would get. It would take 2 weeks to receive a letter and another week, and the intensity of what we have today, of the discourse today, is huge because all the communication's instant. I expect in 1917, communication was even slower, and I'm just wondering whether that's the thing that makes what Donald Trump's doing today worse than the Balfour Declaration.
Yeah, totally different question. I was just wondering if you have any particular advice for any younger journalists looking to report in or around the region, or particularly between Israel and Palestine, from you.
Sorry, I missed the first part. What is it?
Just if you had any particular advice for younger journalists looking to report in or around that region.
Okay.
Thank you. I really enjoyed your talk. I'm sorry to say that I share your understanding that these are two national narratives that are running in parallel lines that seem to never be able to meet. But do you see the role of journalism to report on each of these narratives, or to take a more activist or interventionist approach to try and find a way to, if not merge these narratives, help them converge in the future?
So I don't think what Trump is doing, I haven't heard it, of course, but I think we know pretty much what he's going to do. I don't think it's on the same level of importance as the Balfour Declaration. You're not comparing like and like. The situation that exists today exists for a very, very long time. It's very complicated. Trump is making it worse, in my view, for his own reasons. Whether it's, I don't know. Nobody really knows, do they? We don't know. It's very irresponsible given the role that he is playing. But on the other hand, there are parallel worries about what he's doing with regard to, climate change or North Korea or promoting Islamophobia. I think this is an unhelpful intervention that will doubtless have some kind of negative consequences. But I do agree with you that the speed and magnification of things because of the modern media is a hugely important element of this. In the Balfour Declaration, just to make the comparison, precisely a century ago, the Balfour Declaration was revealed in private initially by the British cabinet to the Zionist leadership. The existence of it wasn't published until a week later in the Jewish Chronicle at the time. It was never published in Palestine itself because the British, who by then were ruling the country, were worried about its implications. And it took a long time for the news and its implications to feed through. So speed and intensity of media coverage today really, really does matter. Advice for journalists, I'm a bit stumped beyond the general advice that I give to anybody who is contemplating a career in journalism. I don't see why in principle it should be different for this admittedly divisive and contentious issue. You need to be an enthusiast, you need to want to communicate information, you need to be prepared to work quite hard in sometimes difficult circumstances. You need to understand that however little you know, you probably know more than most of your readership. The lessons are universal ones, and you apply them in the certainly difficult circumstances of this inevitably controversial issue in which people on both sides are angry for different reasons. So it can be very challenging. But the fundamentals of it are no different from, reporting on, the scandalous handling of the village flower show or whatever. Shouldn't really be an exception, I don't think.
I guess I was wondering particularly if there was ever an element of discomfort of being an outsider telling someone else's story.
Well, I think that you can have that feeling in any circumstances. Not specific to this. What right have you got to summarise a complex, difficult, tragic, terrible situation that has ruined somebody's life or whatever? But that's not, again, that's a universal point. It can happen a lot in the difficult circumstances of this story. There's somebody up there, you asked about narratives and journalism and activism. I think the answer is it depends what kind of journalism it is. Journalism comes in different shapes and sizes, does it not? There's an effort to try to report things, to explain things. My preferred form of journalism is to explain things, to analyse them, what they mean, because sometimes often it isn't at all clear. Activism is a different matter. I think you do it, whatever cause you're supporting, but you do it in a clearly identifiable way. And it's important to make those old-fashioned distinctions between, reporting, analysis, and opinion/advocacy, because, of course, there's a lot of that in this area. So maintaining the distinctions, I think, is what is important.
You started in 1917 and showed that every 10 years from then was a year of great significance. Had you started in 1916 or 1918 or any other year, would you still not have been able to demonstrate that every 10 years was of great significance? In other words, wasn't every year for the last 100 years of great significance in this conflict?
Well, I mean, Tony, you're just being a spoiler. I mean, it's just a neat argument about the recurrence of important events at intervals. But of course, important things happened all the time. But those years do stand out. I think you'd agree.
I haven't read your book, but one of the things I've noticed it praised for in reviews is for its relative impartiality. Considering everybody, or most people, have quite strong opinions on this conflict, I'd like to ask how cognizant you had to be of your own biases when writing the book, or if you found it quite easy to detach yourself from the subject.
I was, of course, very conscious of that. How could you not be? My starting point, I suppose, is that I'm quite familiar with and sympathetic to both sides of this story, but that doesn't mean I don't have a clear view on how it unfolded and what should happen and how there might maybe one day be a happy end. I think if you read the book, you will see that the way that I have structured it shows quite clearly that I think that the history of this conflict has led in one direction only, which is that there are indeed two peoples, whether you approve of the circumstances or not in which that happened, that now find themselves, incidentally, in almost equal numbers. It's an interesting fact that today, in 2017, for the last couple of years, the population figures show there are almost equal numbers of Arabs and Jews, 6.3 million or so of each, living between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River. Now, of course, within those categories, there are lots of subcategories and huge generalizations. My own view is that the conflict can only be resolved when there are two states for two peoples in that land. I was conscious, of course, of other people's views of the toxicity and the divisiveness of the debate, and I based the story on, what I hope is a fair account. Again, my most important aim, you decide if I've done it, was to tell the story of and from both sides. And that's what I've tried to do. But in terms of the outcome, my view is clear. I hope it is, at least.
Hi, Mr. Black. My name is Nishat Ahmed. I'm a journalism student here. I just actually wanted to talk to you about the realities on the ground in terms of the people. Do you think the issues in the Middle East are actually probably far too important to be left to politicians? And do you consider the agency of the people that should be more, that in the media we should talk more about the efforts that the ordinary people are making?
Thank you. As I believe Ian knows, I've done a lot of work on cross-conflict dialogue in the Israeli-Palestinian situation, not between politicians, but between students who come to study here at City University on scholarships and have 3 whole years at a distance from the conflict to reflect on what it's about. I would like to ask you to reflect on a thought that I want to put to you, because my experience of these narratives, and I agree with you, they do not communicate with each other. They're not mirror images. They are separate and parallel. But what I've also observed is self and other are written or incorporated into both narratives. And I perceive the conflict is deepening not only because there's less and less direct contact between Israelis and Palestinians, but also because the justification for the non-resolution of the conflict requires that both narratives increase the demonization of the other. And for it to be resolved, one would have to come to terms with the fact that the other is not the devil. And I don't see that potential horizon approaching. I see it receding.
Thank you. If I might pick up on that point, Gilad Halpern, you suggested that Ian's book had been primarily written for a Western audience, but I wonder whether it would not be very helpful for it to be read also by Israelis and by Palestinians, and I wonder what prospect there is of that actually happening.
All those questions are really interesting because they're all they overlapping and linked to each other. I mean, of course, it's important to write about what ordinary people do on the ground and not just the politicians who generally make things worse. I quite agree. I think there's a good deal of that these days. I think that the sort of educational initiatives. I think there's a good example. For example, there's a school network. It's only inside Israel, not the occupied territories. Yad B'Yad, right? Which is a very rare thing. It's a school that has both Jewish and Arab pupils. And it's indicative, of course, of the wider situation that it is so rare. But I know people who send their kids to that school. I know kids who go to those schools. And it is actually quite remarkable. I think language is huge. I mean, I'm a bit of a language buff, perhaps. But I do think language really matters. It's important to make some distinctions here. Palestinian citizens of Israel all speak fluent Hebrew. Jewish citizens of Israel very, 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 very rarely, something like 2%, speak Arabic. In the occupied territories, of course, it's far more extreme than that. But things that involve people, Arabs and Jews, doing things together, and particularly closing the language gap, I think they're small but very, very significant efforts. And actually, if I can just advertise something about my book, just briefly. One of the things I do in the book, which is unusual in books of this kind, I actually do devote quite a lot of space throughout the book, or certainly from 1948, to Israel's Palestinian minority. 20% of the population of the Jewish state are Arabs, Muslims and Christians. And my experience, actually quite recently, including on a recent visit, you meet Israeli Palestinian citizens who are involved in public life. It is actually quite heartening to see in those very difficult circumstances how much they can do together. I think these things are reported more, maybe not enough. Inevitably, the news is dominated by, the sort of thing that we're going to see today. But I think that is understood in the media. Rosie, I think I agree with everything that you said, and I agree that the prospects of, decreasing demonization are being reduced all the time. I refer back to what I've just said about one of those areas where there is some contact, and it goes back to what has changed since the Second Intifada. That contact has decreased. I remember it was absolutely fascinating when I met Gilad for the first time at your olive tree farewell party, 2 years ago, I think now. It is remarkable to see young Israelis and Palestinians with each other. That isn't something you ever normally see. And anything that can promote that, I think, can only be a good thing. Now, I know you bear the scars of some of the difficulty of doing that, but what a great thing it is. And I think that, again, language and bringing people together is, when the overarching political circumstances look so grim and hopeless, that is something you can do. Of course, on the Palestinian side, and particularly, especially in the occupied territories, there is a lot of resistance to that. It's one of the things that's changed a lot since the days when I was a correspondent. You could have your own sort of, progressive-ish views, and you could meet together with Israeli and Palestinian friends, often journalists, intellectuals, whatever, all, some of them quite well-known people on both sides, and you could do things together. You can't really do that anymore. You haven't been able to do that for about 15 years. So what is called normalization, in a very derogatory sense, is also about people not being together, increasing, as you say, that mutual demonization. You, gentlemen there, you asked about my book. To be honest, my book could be read, of course, by Israelis and Palestinians, but it wouldn't tell them much they didn't know, and they might well be irritated by the inevitable, condensation of their own stories in the way that I've done it. I stand by what I've written, of course, but they have a vast literatures of their own. Many people, intellectuals, writers, historians, journalists on both sides, who I, of course, in time-honoured fashion have stolen freely from. I've usually acknowledged it, I like to think. But there's plenty of people on both sides. There are more on the Israeli side because it is a more open society and a more tolerant society than the Palestinian side. But there are plenty of people on both sides who have written and said highly intelligent and perceptive things about the conflict. I don't think I have much to teach them. But, I mean, if it's useful, then, ahlan wa sahlan, as they would say.
Hi. My question is, what do you think you contributed in terms of the book that was written, in terms of the general kind of knowledge? Because you said that a lot of material has been written up to now and been covered. But what do you think, why do you think your book is different than others? Or how is it better? Or
sorry, last bit?
How is it? Is it better? Is it different? Is it gives a different perspective? Is it sell it to us?
Nicholas Wood. We run study tours throughout Israel and also the West Bank, and Dahlia very kindly contributes to them. I want to know where, Ian, you get your belief in the two-state solution and perhaps an idea of optimism about that. When we travel around the West Bank, I think it's very difficult to see the viability of a Palestinian state. I think the PA only controls about 17% of the area. There's a huge amount of disillusionment with the government there, and there are many young Palestinians who really no longer see the possibility of a Palestinian state taking place. So, and geographically, just seeing the entrenchment of Israel within that, whether it's the roads, the infrastructure, it's very hard, just even visually looking around, to see how that could become a Palestinian state or nation again. And I'd like to see how you could see that working.
Thank you very much. My question was around Brexit and how do you see the UK's role in the conflict, its changes, both in terms of the diplomacy changing, quite obviously, but also in terms of the change in the discourse in this country and sort of more discussion around xenophobia, Islamophobia, etc. here. Thank you.
So, why is my book different? What I've told myself, I mean, you'll have to read it and decide whether I'm right. What I've told myself is, I mean, I've mentioned some of this already. So I'm telling the story of an entire century plus a bit more, which has actually not been done very often. And it certainly hasn't been done in an accessible way. So I've already mentioned that I have tried to tell the story of and from both sides, which is difficult to do, rarely attempted. Again, the reader will have to judge whether I've succeeded in doing that. I've talked about the familiar elements of the story. I mean, it can be quite boring to rehearse them all. I've done that because you can't avoid those inevitable milestones of war and diplomacy and peace initiatives and so on. But I've tried to go beyond that to give a sense of ordinary people, their lives, economic, culture, language, to make the story a bit more human than it is conventionally. And the last thing I've done is my story stays more or less completely within the borders of Israel and Palestine, whatever period. It's not a history of the Arab-Israeli conflict. It doesn't take you much it does a bit, but not really to Damascus and to Washington and London and Cairo. It stays on the ground in this disputed country. But I mean, you have to judge. Yeah, the tours. I mean, I didn't say that I believe that two states is going to happen. Very easy to enumerate all the reasons why it isn't very likely. Nevertheless, I think that there is no other solution. I understand that people have, particularly on the Palestinian side, have despaired of it, but I don't myself see that there is any other possible solution. The argument goes like this. It's not particularly original from me, but I concur with it, that it is so difficult to achieve a two-state solution. But then you're going to move from that to achieve what some people call a one-state solution with no possible way to achieve that. Minuscule support for it on both sides, no activity designed to achieve it. So you have one thing that's difficult and a second thing that's even more difficult. So you decide you're going to go for the more difficult option. With the two-state solution, it may look unlikely, but it is nevertheless possible. Israeli withdrawal from the occupied territories, removal of settlements, etc., etc. The actual settlements, as I'm sure you know, if you go there frequently, take up quite a small area of land in themselves. There are other things too. There are Israeli army firing zones and all kinds of nature reserves, and there are roads and tunnels and areas that are for access for Jewish settlers only. But the actual infrastructure of the settlements takes up a relatively small space. The second point, of course, is well known, that it is the significant numbers of settlements are either on, straddling, or very close to the Green Line, and with a political settlement often discussed. There would be, argument about that, land swaps. You will keep 9% but give you 8.5. We'll keep the enclave around Modi'in, but you can have some land by Gaza. So the model is there. The fact that it hasn't been achieved is indisputable. I still think, myself, there is no other viable or likely solution to the conflict. Brexit, what a relief. A bit of light relief. Brexit, I think, Brexit is going to have a devastating effect on this country, on its economy, on its role in the world. It was interesting, actually, even today, I don't know whether anybody else noticed this, that I thought, given the controversy around what Trump is about to do or already done, the British government was very slow to say anything about it, which actually conforms with what it did at the end of last year between the American election and Trump's inauguration, when Britain voted in the Security Council for the resolution that John Kerry cared so much about, voted for it, and then Theresa May attacked John Kerry in his subsequent speech about it. And it seemed to me that was part of a, preemptive Trump, cozying up to Trump, and we've all seen where that has got us in the last few days. So I think that Britain's role, which is ironic given its historic position in terms of the conflict, can only be diminished by Brexit as on other international fronts.
Okay, unfortunately, I think we're out of time, which is sad because these are excellent questions, but I really want to thank everybody. I just want to remind our audience we've been talking about with Ian Black about his new book, Enemies and Neighbors, Arabs and Jews in Palestine and Israel, 1917 to 2017. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Also thank the City University of London for hosting us, Dr. James Rogers, Gilad Halpern, my co-host. And I would also like to mention that we are launching for the first time a fundraising campaign. If you like the Tel Aviv Review and you want us to survive, please go on to our website, telavivreview.org, and consider donating. Thank you to everybody for coming.